Hello and welcome. Today, we delve into a tense, shadowy world where deception, loyalty, and paranoia collide during the desperate days of December 1944 in Belgium's Ardennes forest. A small checkpoint, a convoy in American uniforms, yet beneath the surface, something far more sinister is unfolding. Imagine soldiers in authentic-looking American gear, speaking perfect English, only to be revealed as German infiltrators armed with British-made weapons, their true identities hidden behind a carefully crafted disguise. Could a simple question about baseball or Hollywood movies expose a spy? How did a single capture ignite a wave of suspicion that transformed the entire Allied war effort into a maze of checkpoints and interrogations? And what if, behind those questions, lay a plan to assassinate the very leader of the Allied forces, General Eisenhower himself? In this story, a covert German operation aimed at infiltrating Allied lines with disguised commandos nearly succeeded, until a handful of prisoners, speaking broken English and dressed as Americans, were caught and swiftly executed under international law, their graves at Lommel marking a tragic cost. Meanwhile, the German leadership, led by Hitler and masterful operatives like Scott C., devised daring schemes, disguised units, fake tanks painted in American insignia, and elaborate deception tactics, trying to turn the tide of the Battle of the Bulge. But how effective could such tricks be when the Allies had their own secret weapons, cultural knowledge, shared memories, and instinctive familiarity with what it truly meant to be American? What if the greatest vulnerability of these infiltrators was not their weapons or disguises, but the very essence of American identity itself, its shared language, humor, sports, and stories? Elements that outsiders could never fully imitate? Could a soldier's quick-witted "nuts" response or a guard's casual question about the Chicago Cubs reveal the difference between loyalty and treachery? And how did the chaos of suspicion and rapid justice, trials, executions, and the deaths of 17 spies reshape the moral boundaries of wartime law? This is more than a story of espionage. It's a reflection on how culture and deception shape our understanding of loyalty, how a simple question can decide life or death, and how the fog of war often blurs the line between friend and foe. The true battle was fought not only in the snow-covered forests but also within the minds of soldiers and commanders, where trust was fragile, and the cost of betrayal was measured in lives. Now, as we explore this chapter of history, ask yourself, how much of what we believe about loyalty, identity, and deception can be truly trusted when the enemy wears our face? The story is about to begin. On the morning of December 17, in the year 1944, a crisp winter dawn blanketed the Belgian countryside in a serene, frosty silence. Outside the small, remote settlement of Iwela, a narrow checkpoint stood as a silent sentinel. The air was so cold that every breath from the personnel was visible in the crisp atmosphere, forming fleeting clouds that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. A sturdy military jeep approached and came to a halt as the soldier manning the checkpoint raised his hand, signaling the vehicle to stop. The man's face was tense, eyes sharp, alert for any sign of danger or deception. Inside the vehicle sat 3 soldiers dressed in what appeared to be authentic American military uniforms, clothing that looked convincingly official, with patches and insignia that seemed legitimate enough, and weapons that matched the standard issue used by American troops. They conversed in English that, at first glance, sounded quite convincing, almost indistinguishable from the genuine article. Despite this outward appearance of normalcy, Sergeant William Creel, a seasoned and vigilant soldier, had been briefed about an extraordinary threat, a threat that challenged everything he had been taught about warfare, loyalty, and the nature of honor itself. He had been warned that enemy agents might be operating covertly behind American lines, dressed in American uniforms, speaking American words, and blending seamlessly into the ranks. Their mission was to sow confusion, gather intelligence, and perhaps sabotage Allied efforts from within. Creel knew he had to verify the identity of these men. Carefully, he asked for the secret password, a simple yet vital code that would confirm their allegiance and authenticity. When the soldiers hesitated before answering, their responses faltered, revealing cracks in their composure. Creel pressed again, his gaze scrutinizing their every move. It was then that he noticed something troubling. The weapons they carried were not American issue but British-made Sten guns, unusual for American troops, especially in such a remote outpost. The realization struck him with certainty. Within moments, the three men were disarmed and taken into custody. Under their olive drab uniforms, the soldiers revealed their true identities. They wore the gray of the German Wehrmacht, a stark contrast to the American guise they had donned. The prisoners, Untisha Manfred Peruz, Oberfenrig Gunther Billing, and Geta Wilhelm Schmidt, had unwittingly become some of the most notorious captives of the Battle of the Bulge, a fierce and pivotal confrontation during the Second World War. Yet, what none of them could have anticipated was that their capture would ignite a wave of paranoia and suspicion that would sweep through the American military establishment. This wasn't merely about individual espionage. It was the genesis of an extensive, systematic campaign of cultural and ideological interrogation that would transform every checkpoint into a battleground of trust and deception. Entire conversations, simple exchanges, became tests of allegiance, and every soldier was scrutinized for signs of disloyalty or subversion. The methods of detection began to evolve far beyond traditional espionage tactics. Instead of relying solely on secret codes or ciphered messages, the authorities started using seemingly innocuous subjects, baseball statistics, the capitals of states, Hollywood gossip, as tools for interrogation and verification. This new form of suspicion was based on the idea that certain knowledge, seemingly trivial to outsiders, could reveal whether someone was genuinely loyal or secretly working for the enemy. This wave of suspicion had its origins earlier that fall, on October 22, 1944, at Hitler's headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia. Adolf Hitler himself summoned SS Obergruppenführer Otto Scott-C, a man of considerable influence and a master of deception, with instructions that would profoundly shape the final months of the war. Hitler entrusted Scott-C with a secret mission, one that would require subterfuge of an unprecedented scale. Scott-C, already infamous as one of Germany's most feared and effective commandos, had a record of daring and clandestine operations. In September of 1943, Scott-C had led a daring glider assault that succeeded in rescuing Benito Mussolini from a mountain prison at Gran Sasso. The operation involved a carefully planned extraction, carried out in the dead of night, with a light plane that narrowly cleared the rocky terrain surrounding the fortress. That mission had cemented Scott-C's reputation as a master of covert operations. By October of 1944, Scott-C had orchestrated another high-stakes kidnapping, this time capturing Miklos Horthy Jr., the son of Hungary's regent. The operation was designed to pressure Hungary's leadership, forcing Horthy to resign and keep Hungary entangled in Germany's war effort. Now Hitler was about to give Scott-C a task even more audacious, a plan that could change the course of the conflict. Hitler's vision was to launch a massive counteroffensive through the Ardennes forest, an ambitious attempt to punch through the Allied lines and threaten the vital port of Antwerp. Success would recreate a strategic nightmare for the Allies during the tense days leading up to their covert operations, Scozzini and his men donned disguises that replicated the uniforms of American and British soldiers. These small, clandestine units, clad in enemy attire, possessed the power to sow chaos on a massive scale. Hitler explained that such deception could severely disrupt military communications, mislead enemy troop movements, and instill widespread panic among Allied forces. The precision of these tactics lay in their subtlety. By blending seamlessly into the enemy's ranks, they could operate unnoticed and cause havoc from within. Scorzani, fully aware of the gravity of this strategy, listened intently and immediately grasped the implications under the strict framework of international law. The Hague Convention of the year 1907 was unambiguous. Soldiers caught wearing the uniforms of the opposing side forfeited their legal protections as prisoners of war and could even face execution for espionage. This stark reality prompted intense discussions among the German leadership, including General R. Alfred Jodl and Field Marshal Georg von Rundstedt, who deliberated the moral and legal risks involved. Hitler confidently assured Scozzini that such tactics were legitimate, provided his men removed the enemy uniforms before engaging in active combat, thereby minimizing legal repercussions. Within a few days, Scozzini submitted his detailed operational plans to General Jodl. His request called for a force of 3,300 men, individuals selected for their fluency in English and familiarity with American dialects, which would be essential for their undercover missions. On October 25, the Oberkommando des Heers issued an official directive across all headquarters along the Western Front, calling for volunteers who could speak English fluently to participate in secret commando operations. This order was personally signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Kittel himself, emphasizing the importance of linguistic proficiency and cultural knowledge, specifically American idioms. Recognizing the strategic value of this intelligence, Scozzini understood that the Allied forces would soon become aware of this initiative. He requested permission to abort the operation altogether, fearing that the Allies might intercept and counter it effectively. However, Hitler swiftly rejected this plea, insisting that the plan proceed as scheduled. Indeed, the Allies intercepted the German order by the end of November, the 30th day of that month. Yet, the Allied intelligence officers dismissed it as a mere ploy, unable to believe that the Germans would display such audacity in openly requesting English-speaking volunteers for clandestine missions. The Germans, undeterred, continued their efforts to recruit. Volunteers from across all branches of the German military rapidly responded, many of whom had little understanding of what they truly signed up for. Among them was Fritz Priest, a 21-year-old Luftwaffe private assigned to serve as an English translator. His initial assumption was that he would be interrogating American prisoners from a safe distance, far from the chaos of combat zones. Instead, Fritz found himself confined behind barbed wire within a training camp established at Grafenwehr, located in eastern Bavaria, where security measures were extraordinarily strict. One unfortunate volunteer was shot dead simply because his letter home contained too much detail, an indication of how tightly controlled the intelligence and security procedures were. The volunteers only learned the precise nature of their mission after arrival at the camp. The reality of what Scozzini had to work with was almost comical. In its absurdity, if the stakes had not been so high, it might have been amusing. Out of the approximately 2,500 men assembled, a mere 10 possessed perfect English skills combined with a thorough understanding of American idioms. An additional 30 to 40 men spoke English well enough but lacked familiarity with American slang and colloquialisms. Another cohort of roughly 120 to 150 soldiers possessed only moderate proficiency in English, while the remaining troops had at best a school-level grasp of the language, barely able to utter more than a simple yes or no. Later, Scorzani recounted that after just a couple of weeks of training, the situation had become terrifying, revealing the impracticality of their linguistic ambitions and the enormous challenge of executing such a complex deception. To make matters worse, the men with minimal English skills were instructed to respond in a very specific way if approached by American soldiers, namely, to exclaim, "Sorry," then quickly open their trousers and fake symptoms of diarrhea, in hopes of fleeing the scene. The equipment situation was equally dire. The German High Command West was asked to supply a substantial array of military hardware, 15 Sherman tanks, 20 armored cars, 20 self-propelled guns, 100 jeeps, 40 motorcycles, 120 trucks, and enough British and American-style uniforms to outfit the entire force. However, the delivery of these supplies fell woefully short of the required quantities. Only 2 Sherman tanks arrived, and both were in poor condition, with one breaking down shortly after being put into service, rendering the entire effort even more precarious and fraught with difficulties. Almost immediately after the initial plans were set in motion, the reality diverged sharply from expectations. Instead of the carefully prepared American armor that had been requested, what arrived on the scene was a motley collection of German equipment: 5 Panther tanks, 6 armored cars, 6 armored personnel carriers, and 5 Sturmgeschütz assault guns. These vehicles were all German-made, and not the American armor that had been anticipated, creating an awkward mismatch between what was needed and what was available. The Panthers, the centerpiece of the armored force, had been hastily disguised to resemble American tanks. They were coated with sheet metal cladding, painted in a drab color typical of American military vehicles, and adorned with white star insignia, the classic emblem used by U.S. forces. Despite these efforts, the commander, Scorzani, later admitted that their deception would only fool very young American soldiers who might be glancing from a great distance during nighttime operations. The illusions were fragile at best, and the camouflage did little to hide the vehicle's true origins from seasoned eyes. The situation with the uniforms was even more chaotic. Many of the soldiers lacked proper American gear altogether. Instead, they were dressed in a confusing patchwork of clothing, some in British, Polish, or Russian uniforms. To make matters worse, quite a few of these uniforms were summer issue gear, despite the fact that the offensive was scheduled for December, a time when winter clothing was essential. Some of the uniforms bore bloodstains, hinting at previous battles or hurried repairs, while others displayed markings like the letter P, which served as crude indicators of their origin or affiliation. Units across Germany, confused by the ambiguous nature of the operation and the vague instructions they had received, sent whatever equipment they could find, regardless of its authenticity or relevance. As a result, the brigade found itself flooded with Polish and Russian uniforms and weaponry from units that had little understanding of the operation's true purpose. It was a chaotic patchwork, a makeshift disguise assembled in haste. Not a well-orchestrated deception. Only a limited number of authentic American uniforms and weapons could be secured, and these were reserved solely for the specialized commandos. To carry out their mission effectively, the best English speakers within the unit were assembled into a dedicated elite team called Einheil, a name derived from SS Captain Ernstello, who was chosen to lead them. Despite the tight schedule, these commandos underwent rigorous, intensive training designed to prepare them for their covert tasks. They studied the organizational structure of the American military, memorized badges of rank, learned American military customs, and practiced drill procedures to imitate real soldiers convincingly. Some members of these teams were sent to specialized camps at Kustrin and Lindbergh, referred to as P camps, to practice their English language skills with captured American soldiers. These encounters provided invaluable immersion, allowing them to pick up American accents and slang by watching American movies, which served as a tool for language mastery and cultural familiarity. They memorized well-known American brand names, sports teams, popular songs, and Hollywood stars, immersing themselves in the cultural nuances that could make their disguise more convincing. The commandos also trained to mimic the mannerisms of Americans, walking, smoking, and even chewing gum just as real U.S. soldiers did. Their training was comprehensive, covering every detail that could enhance their deception during operations. The missions assigned to these specialized units fell into three main categories. First, demolition squads, consisting of 5 to 6 men, were tasked with destroying key infrastructure such as bridges, ammunition depots, and fuel stores, targets vital to disrupting enemy logistics and mobility. Second, reconnaissance patrols, made up of 3 to 4 men each, would conduct scouting missions along both sides of the Meuse River. Their role was to gather intelligence and execute covert actions like passing false orders to American units they encountered, reversing road signs, removing minefield warnings, and cordoning off roads with fake mine warnings to mislead the enemy. Third, the lead commando units would operate in close coordination with the advancing German forces, executing sabotage and communication disruption measures. They would cut telephone wires, destroy radio stations, and issue false orders to sow confusion among American and Allied forces. The risks involved in these missions were immense. If captured while wearing American uniforms, the commandos faced almost certain execution. Such was the brutality of the wartime environment. However, there was an even more subtle peril: friendly fire. Amid the chaos of battle, there was a real danger that German troops might mistake these disguised commandos for genuine Americans and shoot them down. To mitigate this risk, the commandos employed specific signals for identification. Vehicles displaying a small yellow triangle, tanks maintaining particular gun positions, and soldiers wearing colored scarves beneath their uniforms all served as secret markers to distinguish friend from foe. On the 14th of December, the Panzer Brigade 150 assembled near Bad Münstereifel, preparing for their daring operation. By the afternoon of the 16th of December, they began their movement under the directive of Joachim Peiper. A strategic plan was set into motion. If Peiper's heavily armored spearhead managed a swift breach of enemy defenses, the disguised troops of Skorzeny could exploit the ensuing chaos, slipping through unnoticed and racing ahead to seize the vital bridges before the American engineers could destroy them, thereby potentially crippling the Allies' logistical route. On the morning of December 16, in the year of 1944, the pre-dawn hours marked the beginning of a fierce and ambitious offensive. The dark, dense forests of the Ardennes were alive with movement as more than 200,000 German soldiers launched what would turn out to be Hitler's final grand attack in the Western theater of the war. The element of surprise was complete. The Germans struck with overwhelming force against a fragile and stretched thin American front that stretched roughly 80 miles across the dense, snow-laden landscape. The attacking force comprised 30 German divisions, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, while the American forces who faced them were fewer in number and less experienced, either freshly trained or worn down from prior engagements. The initial German artillery barrage shattered the stillness of the frozen morning, sending a deadly curtain of shells crashing into the trees and the earth, while searchlights pierced the low-hanging clouds, illuminating the battleground in stark, blinding beams that revealed the chaos unfolding below. German infantry units pushed forward through the snow-covered forests, their movements masked by the winter gloom. Panzers rumbled along narrow, icy roads, advancing steadily into American-held territory. For the first few hours, everything unfolded according to detailed planning. The offensive was launched with precision, catching the defenders unprepared. Meanwhile, the Einhalle teams, specially trained infiltrators, moved through the confusion of the battlefield. Dressed in American uniforms and driving captured jeeps, they cleverly slipped past the American lines, their presence hidden amidst the chaos of retreat and reorganization. One team boldly drove directly into a town controlled by American forces, mapping out defenses and then, during their withdrawal, deliberately redirected an American convoy of armored vehicles and supplies onto the wrong road. Two other teams successfully misled Allied convoys by spreading false information, cutting telephone wires, removing road signs, and disseminating rumors of a German breakthrough that was more extensive than the actual penetration. Each maneuver designed to sow disarray and misdirect the enemy. However, by December 17, the harsh realities of war began to undermine these daring plans. The 1st SS Panzer Division failed to meet its scheduled objectives. Strong American resistance at Elsenborn Ridge effectively blocked the northern routes the Germans desperately needed, delaying their advance. Fierce fighting at St. Vith, a key strategic point, delayed the German timetable by nearly a week, undermining the rapid breakthrough that was essential for the success of Operation Griff. The swift, decisive movement that the operation depended upon was no longer a viable prospect, and Scorzani, observing the deteriorating situation, recognized that the original goals of the mission were unattainable. In response, he attended a staff meeting at the 6th Panzer Army headquarters and proposed reassigning his brigade to serve as a conventional combat unit rather than as specialized commandos. The request was granted. Orders were issued for Panzer Brigade 150 to assemble south of Malmedy and report directly to the 1st SS Panzer Division. Yet, by that point, some of the commandos had already gone behind enemy lines, executing their missions with varying degrees of success. Several of them were captured when American soldiers, increasingly wary and alert, challenged their passwords or noticed inconsistencies, such as British weapons or German boots, while others faltered under pressure, unable to answer rudimentary questions about American culture or language. The capture of operatives like Paris, Billing, and Schmidt near Ivy on December 17 struck a decisive blow, creating chaos that would ultimately define the true impact of the entire operation. Interrogations of these captured agents yielded startling revelations, especially from Schmidt. His statement sent shockwaves through Allied intelligence networks. He claimed that their mission was not merely a localized attack but part of a broader scheme aimed at infiltrating the very heart of Allied command, specifically, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, and either capturing or assassinating General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself. Whether Schmidt genuinely believed this rumor or was deliberately spreading disinformation remains uncertain, but the implications of such a claim added a dangerous layer of complexity to the intelligence picture, fueling fears of a potential high-level infiltration that could threaten the Allied leadership at a critical juncture in the conflict. There has never been any concrete evidence to support the notion that such a detailed plan existed in reality. In fact, the true objective of the mission was simply to seize specific strategic bridges crossing the Meuse River. However, the declaration of this supposed plan had immediate and far-reaching repercussions that could not be ignored. Within a matter of hours, the security measures surrounding General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied forces, were drastically heightened. It was as if he had been placed under virtual house arrest, He was confined within his headquarters located in Versailles, surrounded by an ever-increasing number of guards. These guards meticulously scrutinized every individual attempting to enter the building, creating a highly restrictive environment. This sudden confinement reportedly infuriated Eisenhower, especially as it persisted through the Christmas holiday period, when he longed for the freedom to move more freely and focus on the ongoing military efforts. After enduring this confinement for several days, Eisenhower, visibly furious and increasingly impatient, publicly declared that he needed to get out and that he was no longer concerned about potential threats to his life. He made it clear that he was willing to risk any attempt on his life rather than remain imprisoned. Yet, the pervasive sense of paranoia extended far beyond merely safeguarding Eisenhower himself. The Allied forces, already shaken by a fierce German offensive, began to perceive threats of infiltration and sabotage everywhere. As a result, checkpoints suddenly appeared throughout the rear areas of the Allied front, effectively turning what was once open territory into a maze of suspicion and delays. These checkpoints significantly hampered the movement of troops, supplies, and communications, causing widespread logistical disruptions. American military police officers, known as MPs, began conducting exhaustive interrogations of every soldier passing through these points. The questions they posed ranged from basic geographic knowledge, such as the capital of Illinois, to obscure details about American sports teams, Hollywood celebrities, and slang prevalent in the United States. The MPs improvised their questions constantly, creating a chaotic and often absurd system, trying to identify potential German infiltrators disguised as American soldiers. This interrogation system proved to be flawed and inconsistent. Many genuine American soldiers, unfamiliar with certain regional or cultural details, struggled to answer the questions correctly. For example, soldiers from different parts of the country sometimes lacked knowledge of state capitals or sports statistics because of regional educational disparities or personal interests. As a consequence, a number of honest soldiers found themselves detained simply because they failed to recall a single piece of American trivia. The problems caused by these checkpoints were numerous and serious. For instance, General Omar Bradley was detained when he correctly identified Springfield as the capital of Illinois. Yet, the MP on duty believed the answer was Chicago and refused to release him until his identity could be definitively verified. Similarly, Brigadier General Bruce Clark was held at gunpoint after incorrectly claiming that the Chicago Cubs played in the American League, overlooking the fact that they actually played in the National League. Furthermore, some soldiers faced detention for seemingly minor or bizarre reasons. A captain was detained for an entire week after authorities discovered he was wearing German military boots as souvenirs, which they deemed suspicious. British soldiers found themselves in particularly difficult situations. When reconnaissance officer David Nann was asked who won the 1940 World Series, he could only reply that he had no idea, as he was unfamiliar with American sports trivia. British troops who could not answer questions about American geography or cultural details were detained until their identities could be confirmed through other means, which often proved to be a lengthy process. In some cases, American soldiers responded to the absurdity of the interrogations by deliberately providing false answers to avoid detention. Others, frustrated and angry at being questioned by lower-ranking personnel, sometimes refused to cooperate, leading to confrontations that further slowed military operations. These chaotic and often arbitrary checks significantly hampered troop movements, turning what should have been quick, efficient maneuvers into drawn-out, cumbersome procedures. Vehicles and personnel that normally would have taken hours to pass through checkpoints were delayed for days, hampering the overall effectiveness of the Allied military campaign during this tense period of the war. The operation was abruptly halted, and every individual involved was subjected to rigorous interrogation. Supply convoys, halted at various checkpoints, remained in place as drivers and crews were questioned in an attempt to verify their American identity and allegiance. Meanwhile, units dispatched to reinforce vulnerable sectors found their progress impeded by persistent and often invasive questioning. Commanders, expecting straightforward military procedures, were instead confronted with suspicion and skepticism from their troops, many of whom doubted the loyalty of their peers, fearing that some might be German infiltrators disguised as Americans. This atmosphere of distrust severely affected the morale and psychological stability of the infiltrators themselves, who faced intense scrutiny and the constant threat of exposure. Those operatives who remained behind the American lines quickly realized that their freedom of movement was severely restricted. The intense questioning and cultural probes aimed to uncover any signs of insincerity or lack of preparedness. Despite their meticulous study of American military protocols, rank insignia, and organizational structure, many infiltrators found themselves unprepared for questions about seemingly trivial topics such as baseball statistics, Hollywood celebrities, or regional slang. These cultural questions often exposed gaps in their knowledge and revealed their superficial preparations, making them more vulnerable to suspicion. In response, some infiltrators opted to avoid checkpoints altogether, choosing instead to traverse the country by crossing forests, fields, or less traveled paths, though this approach increased their visibility to American patrols. Others attempted to deceive the authorities by bluffing their way through checkpoints, inventing plausible excuses for their inability to answer specific questions, or claiming ignorance of certain details. However, very few of these tactics proved successful. During the period from December 16 to December 31 of the year 1944, American forces managed to apprehend 23 members of Operation Greif. Of these, 16 were captured during December, with the team leader, Gauss Schultz, being detained later and subsequently tried in May of the following year, 1945. Each captured infiltrator was subjected to a military tribunal, operating under the clear stipulations set forth by international law. The Hague Convention concerning Land Warfare, specifically Article 23, explicitly prohibited the improper use of enemy military insignia and uniforms. Under this legal framework, soldiers caught wearing enemy uniforms while engaged in military operations could be prosecuted not merely as prisoners but as spies, facing severe penalties. The first such trial commenced at Hungry-Chapelle on December 21, 1944. The defendants, Pernas, Billing, and Schmidt, stood accused of violating the laws of war by donning American uniforms during their clandestine activities. The evidence presented against them was irrefutable. They had been apprehended dressed in American military uniforms, armed with American weapons, carrying American identification documents, yet beneath their uniforms, they concealed German field gray clothing. The trial moved quickly and decisively, and all three defendants were found guilty and sentenced to death by firing squad. On December 23, 2 days before Christmas, the sentences were carried out in accordance with military procedure. The American military police escorted the condemned men to the execution site, where Captain J. Iser of the 633rd Medical Clearing Station prepared the firing squad. He placed white paper targets over each of their hearts, and Schmidt's glasses were removed to prevent any last-minute attempts at communication or distraction. The prisoners were blindfolded, and the soldiers formed into a firing squad. As Billing shouted a final, defiant declaration, "Long live our Führer, Adolf Hitler," the rifles were fired, and the 3 men died instantly. Their bodies were subsequently taken down, carried away, and transported for burial. In due course, their remains were laid to rest at the German military cemetery located in Lommel, Belgium, a resting place shared by more than 39,000 other German soldiers who had fallen in the conflict. Over the course of the same period, between December 21 and December 31 of 1944, 13 additional operatives associated with Operation Greif faced similar tribunals and were executed at either Hungry-Chapelle or Way. Among these were Wilhelm Wiesenfeld, Manfred Brani, Hans Reich, Arno Kroer, Gunter Schultz, Gerhard Miegel, and Host Gericke, all of whom met the same fate for their roles in the covert operation against the Allied forces. Norbert Pollock, Ralph Benjamin Meyer, Hans Witzuk, Otto, Alfred Franz, and Anton Morik all faced the grim fate of being executed by firing squad. Each of these tragic executions took place under the auspices of a military trial, a process that was rigorous and formal, yet relentless in its outcome. In every case, the court-martial declared the defendants guilty of breaching the stipulations set forth in the HEG Convention, a set of international standards governing wartime conduct. Following these verdicts, each sentence was subjected to review and ultimate approval by higher-ranking military commanders, whose authority sanctioned the finality of these harsh sentences. The actual implementation of the executions was carried out with a chilling military precision, methodical and efficient, devoid of any personal malice but utterly without mercy. Each step was executed with discipline, reflecting the cold efficiency of the military machine. One notable case was that of team leader Gauss Schultz, who was tried by a military commission in May of 1945. He was executed near the town of Branch on the 14th of June, with the entire process seemingly conducted without delay. However, the reasons behind the postponement of Schultz's trial until well after Germany's surrender in May of that same year remain shrouded in mystery. Likewise, the identity of the individual or authority that ultimately ordered his execution continues to be a subject of speculation and uncertainty. It is known that the United States Ninth Army carried out the sentence, acting under the directives of military command, though the precise chain of command that authorized the execution remains unclear. Across the course of Operation Greif, a total of 17 participants were executed specifically for the heinous act of wearing enemy uniforms. Despite the severity of these measures, the tactical achievements of Operation Greif proved to be minimal in the grand scheme of the campaign. No bridges were captured as a result of the operation, and efforts at demolitions did not succeed in crippling enemy infrastructure. Critical communications lines were not permanently disrupted, with only a few road signs being reversed as a minor psychological tactic. Some telephone lines were cut in an attempt to sow confusion, and a handful of American units received false orders, though most of these erroneous commands were swiftly corrected. Nonetheless, the psychological impact of these actions far surpassed any tangible military results, instilling a deep sense of paranoia and insecurity among the American forces. For weeks following these events, the American troops operated under the persistent fear that German infiltrators could be lurking among them at any moment. This pervasive suspicion severely affected decision-making processes at every echelon of command, creating a climate of distrust and hesitation. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Supreme Commander, found himself confined and isolated during this critical early phase of the offensive, deprived of direct, on-the-ground observation of battlefield conditions. This physical and informational separation hindered rapid response times and strategic adjustments. The delays caused by checkpoints and suspicions slowed the American response to the German penetration, resulting in significant operational setbacks. Units that should have reached threatened sectors within hours instead arrived days later, and the widespread suspicion eroded the cohesion and morale of military units. American soldiers, whose primary focus should have been fighting the Germans directly in front of them, instead spent precious time worrying about potential German spies or infiltrators among their ranks. The Battle of the Bulge, which was to become one of the most significant confrontations of the war, proceeded largely unaffected by the failure of Operation Griff. German forces launched a surprise offensive, pushing deep into the American lines and creating the distinct bulge in the front that named the battle. Despite the chaos, American defenders at Bastogne refused to surrender, holding their ground despite being encircled and cut off from supply lines. On December 22, German officers delivered an ultimatum demanding surrender, but the acting American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, famously responded with a single, curt word that would echo through history: nuts. The reply effectively told the German command to go to hell, a bold statement of American resolve. When the bewildered German officers asked for clarification, they were told that nuts was the equivalent of telling them to go to hell in a more forthright manner. The 101st Airborne Division, famously resilient, held their position at Bastogne until they were relieved by Lieutenant General George Patton's Third Army on December 26. Patton's forces executed a remarkable maneuver, turning 90 degrees and driving northward in a swift and decisive counterattack that broke the siege. By early January of 1945, Allied counter-offensives had successfully eliminated the salient, restoring the front lines to their pre-battle positions. The Battle of the Bulge spanned from December 16, 1944, to January 25, 1945. It involved more than 1 million soldiers from Allied forces, making it the largest battle fought by the United States Army outside of the American Civil War. The toll was heavy. American casualties numbered over 80,000, including nearly 19,000 killed in action, and approximately the losses inflicted during that campaign were simply insurmountable for the Germans. They could not find a way to recover from the setbacks they sustained. This particular battle effectively signaled the end of Germany's capacity to launch large-scale offensive operations on the Western Front. It was a decisive turning point, illustrating how Hitler's strategic gamble, placing immense hope on the Ardennes offensive, had ultimately resulted in failure. The Führer had bet everything on this audacious attack, but the outcome clearly demonstrated that his gamble did not pay off, leaving the German forces weakened and unable to mount further aggressive pushes in that theater. For Otto Skorzeny, the culmination of this entire phase of the conflict, known as Operation Grief, came on December 17, when the Panzer Brigade 150 transitioned from their initial offensive role to more conventional military operations, signaling a shift in their tactical focus and operational status. Just 4 days later, on December 21, the brigade attempted to seize control of the town of Malmö. However, their assault was met with fierce resistance, and after several determined attempts, they were forced to withdraw, suffering setbacks that underscored the resilience of the opposing forces. During this period, Otto Skorzeny himself was wounded, struck by shrapnel from artillery fire near Lineville. Despite this injury, he managed to recover fully and continued his service through the remainder of the war, demonstrating resilience and dedication. When Germany finally surrendered in May of 1945, Skorzeny surrendered himself to the American 30th Infantry Regiment, marking the end of his active military involvement in the conflict. Following his surrender, Skorzeny was held in custody for a period of 2 years, during which he awaited trial on various charges. The military tribunals, held in 1947 as part of the DHA trials, brought charges against him and 9 other officers from the Panzer Brigade 150. They faced accusations of improperly using American military uniforms, specifically, entering combat zones dressed in American gear, and of engaging in treacherous acts by firing upon their own forces while disguised. Additional charges included the unlawful procurement of American uniforms and Red Cross parcels from prisoner of war camps. In his defense, Skorzeny emphasized a critical distinction. His orders explicitly mandated that his men remove their American uniforms before engaging in actual combat. The disguises, he argued, were solely intended for infiltration and deception, not for fighting. This legal argument proved pivotal in the trial, especially when a surprise witness was called to testify. Yo Thomas, a former British Special Operations officer, provided compelling evidence that Allied forces had employed similar tactics during their own operations. Thomas recounted his personal experience of wearing German uniforms behind enemy lines during missions in France, highlighting that such disguises were a recognized and accepted form of covert warfare. The military tribunal carefully examined the evidence and the context of these tactics. They drew a clear line between the use of enemy uniforms for deception, considered a legitimate military ruse, and their use during active combat. The tribunal concluded that Skorzeny's orders prohibited fighting while in disguise, and since there was no proof that he had directed his men to engage in combat while armed in American uniforms, he could not be held responsible for such actions. Consequently, all 9 defendants, including Skorzeny, were acquitted of the charges. This verdict, however, did not go unchallenged and sparked considerable controversy. The same actions for which Skorzeny was acquitted, wearing American uniforms and conducting deception, had previously resulted in the execution of 17 of his men in December of 1944. The key difference lay in the timing and the evidence available. The soldiers executed had been captured while in American uniforms and directly involved in combat, whereas Skorzeny's trial demonstrated that his orders explicitly aimed to prevent such engagements. The legal distinction made during the trial clarified that the use of enemy uniforms for deception, as long as the disguises were removed before actual combat, was legally permissible under the laws of war. The significance of this case extended beyond the immediate trial, establishing an important legal precedent concerning wartime conduct. The court's ruling clarified that deception tactics involving enemy uniforms could be considered legitimate strategies, so long as combatants removed their disguises beforehand, thus influencing international legal standards for decades to come. Despite his acquittal, Skorzeny's freedom was short-lived. In 1948, he managed to escape from an internment camp located in Darmstadt. His daring escape was facilitated by former SS officers, who disguised themselves as American military police to aid his breakout. Some historians have speculated that American intelligence agencies may have tacitly permitted or even actively assisted in his escape, although conclusive evidence to support such claims remains elusive. Following his escape, Skorzeny spent some time hiding on a Bavarian farm, before moving on to locations such as Salzburg and Paris. Ultimately, he settled in Spain, where he found work as a military advisor to Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, providing expertise and strategic guidance. During times of upheaval and crisis, symbols such as references to baseball, Hollywood, capital cities, and well-known movie stars emerged as powerful markers of how cultural identity can serve as an essential tool for security. These symbols went beyond mere superficial familiarity. They became part of a broader, intangible fabric that defined what it meant to be American. Even within the chaos of war and espionage, This cultural fabric proved remarkably effective at exposing infiltrators. Those who, despite undergoing language training, could not replicate the natural, ingrained cultural knowledge that Americans absorbed effortlessly from their earliest years. Being truly American involved more than just speaking English fluently or wearing a uniform that conformed to military standards. It was rooted in shared cultural experiences, collective memories, references to movies, music, sports, and historical events that formed an unspoken bond. These elements could not be quickly taught or learned in a matter of weeks. They were ingrained in the social fabric, in the collective subconscious, and served as a sort of cultural fingerprint that was difficult for outsiders to imitate convincingly. When enemy spies or infiltrators encountered this cultural cohesion, it often became their Achilles heel, revealing their otherwise polished veneer of training and disguise. The significance of this cultural unity became especially apparent during covert operations, such as the infamous Operation Grafe. Today, the memory of the 17 men who paid the ultimate price during that operation is preserved largely through military cemeteries and historical documentation. Their graves, located at Lommel, are maintained with a level of care and reverence comparable to that given to soldiers fallen in direct combat. These graves symbolize the tragic cost of espionage and the sacrifices made on the battlefield, regardless of whether the fallen were killed in action or executed as spies. In the cemetery, there is no distinction made between those who died in battle and those who were executed for their roles as spies. All are honored as soldiers of the German war effort. Among them was Manfred Peruz, who was just 23 years old at the time of his execution, and Gunther Billing, only 21, who remained a dedicated Nazi until his final moments. Wilhelm Schmidt, aged 24, faced death with a stoic acceptance. Each of these young men was a son, possibly a brother, caught in the brutal machinery of war, making choices that led them to that frozen morning in Belgium, standing at their posts, blindfolded, awaiting the rifle fire that would end their lives. Operation Grafe's legacy extended far beyond its immediate tactical failure. The operation vividly demonstrated that specialized, covert efforts could not substitute for the broader failures of conventional military strategy. Despite the efforts of infiltrators, they could not seize bridges or secure key strategic points if the regular military units, like Piper's panzer divisions, never reached those critical locations. Deception and confusion, while useful, could not replace the essential breakthrough that never materialized. However, what Operation Grafe did succeed in was creating a level of disruption and psychological chaos that far surpassed what the actual infiltrators managed to accomplish on their own. The perceived threat of infiltration and sabotage, whether real or exaggerated, generated widespread panic among soldiers and commanders alike. This sense of uncertainty and fear created a ripple effect, influencing hundreds of thousands of Allied troops and complicating military operations during one of the most critical early phases of the Battle of the Bulge. This disparity between the perceived danger and the actual threat became one of the vital lessons in modern strategic thought, highlighting the importance of psychological warfare and the power of perception in shaping the course of combat. By the time the Battle of the Bulge drew to a close in late January of the year 1945, Allied forces had regained momentum and resumed their advance toward Germany's heartland. Within a span of approximately 4 months, the Third Reich was brought to its knees, with Adolf Hitler choosing suicide in his bunker beneath Berlin. Germany unconditionally surrendered on May 8, marking the end of the war in Europe. The 17 men involved in Operation Grafe, who had been executed during the operation, were already lying in their graves by this time. Their violent end on Belgian soil, far from their homeland, underscored the brutal reality of war. While their mission had failed in its immediate tactical objectives, it had achieved something else, sowing confusion and fear that hampered Allied efforts during the initial and most delicate phase of the battle. Their sacrifice, tragic as it was, contributed, indirectly, to the overall Allied victory by undermining enemy operations during a critical period. In the midst of the chaos, Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, reflected on the significance of this intense period of fighting. On January 18 of the year 1945, even as the battle still raged fiercely, Churchill publicly declared that this was undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war. He believed that it would be remembered as an ever-famous victory in American military history. Churchill emphasized the scale of American involvement, noting that for every British soldier engaged in the fight, there had been between 30. This episode underscored a fundamental truth. The outcome was primarily an American triumph, rooted deeply in the shared cultural fabric of the United States. The guards manning the checkpoint, who inquired about baseball, were not conscious of the fact that they were inadvertently creating a piece of folklore. Rather, they were simply responding to an immediate security concern. Faced with the need to identify potential threats, they improvised a simple, yet effective, method grounded in their collective cultural knowledge. Their solution succeeded precisely because it stemmed from a genuine, lived familiarity with American traditions, an understanding that had been absorbed naturally over years of growing up in the United States. These guards knew about baseball, Hollywood, and the significance of state capitals not because they memorized facts from a textbook, but because such knowledge had become an integral part of their everyday lives and cultural identity. This distinction between knowledge learned through direct experience and information acquired through formal instruction proved to be a decisive factor in the outcome. The failure of the Germans to emulate this cultural fluency exemplifies a principle that remains highly relevant to modern military and intelligence operations. While they could study facts and memorize details, they could not replicate the intuitive, instinctive understanding that comes from years of genuine immersion within a culture. The Germans' attempt to impersonate Americans lacked this deep-seated familiarity, which ultimately limited their effectiveness. This idea, that cultural fluency cannot be swiftly imparted to adults unfamiliar with a particular society, has profoundly influenced contemporary military strategies. Modern special operations units have drawn lessons from Operation Grafe's mixed results. Recognizing that cultural knowledge is best acquired through prolonged immersion, intelligence agencies now invest extensive time preparing deep cover agents, knowing that mere language training, factual memorization, or behavioral coaching are insufficient on their own. Real cultural understanding requires sustained exposure, lived experiences, and a deep connection to the environment and people, which cannot be rapidly developed in a short period. This enduring challenge, that genuine cultural fluency takes years to cultivate, remains consistent across decades. Culture is something that is absorbed through experience, not simply transmitted through classroom lessons or quick training courses. This insight has shaped the way military and intelligence organizations approach clandestine operations, emphasizing the importance of long-term engagement and relationship building over quick fixes. Operation Grafe served as both a testament to the potential of unconventional military efforts and a reminder of their inherent limitations. Small units, operating covertly, can orchestrate surprises and create disruption that far exceeds their numerical strength. The psychological impact of such operations can sometimes eclipse the tangible tactical results, influencing morale, perceptions, and the broader strategic environment to an extraordinary degree. However, these efforts cannot stand alone. Without the support of broader conventional military success, special operations actions are unlikely to achieve their larger strategic objectives. Deception, while a powerful tool, cannot substitute for outright victory on the battlefield. For military strategists and historians, Operation Grafe remains a compelling case study, an illustration of how overly ambitious planning, disconnected from realistic assessments of capabilities, can lead to failure. This pattern was evident in Hitler's late war decisions, which were characterized by grandiose visions that lacked the necessary resources and were divorced from the operational realities on the ground. Despite its failures, the operation's unintentional success in sowing panic among the enemy validated the concept that psychological warfare and deception can serve as effective force multipliers. The tragic sacrifice of the 17 men who were executed before firing squads, simply for wearing enemy uniforms, might have faded into obscurity if not for the meticulous record-keeping that preserved their stories. These men, who played minor roles and achieved little before their capture, nonetheless became symbols of the complex interplay between legality, morality, and military necessity. Their executions marked a significant moment in both military and legal history, clarifying the application of international law concerning the use of enemy uniforms in warfare. Their legacy endures in the lessons they imparted: the critical importance of identity verification and the recognition that cultural knowledge remains difficult for outsiders to fake convincingly in a short time. While special operations continue to be a valuable component of modern warfare, their effectiveness cannot replace or substitute the fundamental importance of conventional military victories. The laws of war, with their emphasis on legality, morality, and international standards, remain essential guiding principles in wartime conduct. In essence, the events surrounding Operation Grafe illustrate the enduring truth that authentic cultural understanding is a vital, yet fragile, element of military success. It underscores the importance of respecting international legal frameworks and recognizing the limitations of deception and impersonation in complex conflicts. Just as the Guard's instinctive recognition of baseball encapsulated a shared cultural identity, so too does the ability of a nation's military and intelligence services to truly understand the societies they operate within, something that cannot be hurried or faked, continue to shape the outcomes of warfare across generations. The concept of what is considered important in warfare is often subjective, heavily dependent on the particular circumstances of each conflict and the available evidence guiding decisions. While strategic objectives and battlefield victories are undeniably significant, the broader human toll of war extends far beyond the front lines, encompassing the suffering and loss experienced by individuals and their families. This toll is particularly stark when considering the tragic fate of prisoners who, after being captured and judged according to the laws of war, are sometimes executed. These actions, though conducted under the veneer of legal authority and following what was deemed a fair trial, resulted in the premature end of human lives, each one a unique existence with a personal history, hopes, and connections to loved ones. The graves at Lommel Mark serve as silent testimonies to these lives cut short, emblematic of war's brutal logic that often reduces human complexity to mere casualties. Within this grim context, the role of checkpoint guards, those American soldiers who questioned individuals about seemingly trivial matters, such as baseball, illustrates the complex psychological landscape soldiers faced. These guards, operating under strict orders, often carried the heavy emotional burden of executing prisoners, even those convicted of serious crimes like espionage against their own country. Their actions, while lawful in the military framework, left an indelible mark on their psyche, echoing the moral dilemmas faced in wartime. The operation known as Operation Grafe, intended to disrupt enemy movements by targeting strategic points such as bridges, ultimately failed to accomplish its primary goal. Despite the mission's failure to seize a single crossing, it did not cause widespread destruction or loss of life on a large scale. Its significance, however, lies not in its immediate results but in its ripple effects. The operation resulted in the deaths of a relatively small number of American soldiers directly, but the atmosphere of fear and uncertainty it fostered had strategic consequences. This atmosphere of suspicion and caution delayed reinforcements, hampered command decision-making, and drained vital resources during the critical early days of the campaign. While difficult to measure precisely, these psychological and logistical disruptions played a crucial role in shaping the initial phase of the battle. In the aftermath of the infiltrators' capture, trial, and swift execution, often within a matter of days, there was a clear demonstration of American military justice functioning under the intense pressures of wartime. Such rapid proceedings, while swift and decisive, would today be considered insufficiently deliberate, given modern standards emphasizing thorough due process. Nevertheless, this rapid cycle from capture to execution established a precedent, reinforcing the severity and immediacy of wartime justice. The Battle of the Bulge persisted for more than 5 additional weeks after these executions, eventually culminating in a decisive German defeat and the exhaustion of Germany's strategic reserves. This sequence of events underscores how closely military actions, legal proceedings, and broader strategic outcomes can be intertwined. The narrative surrounding Operation Grief and the Battle of the Bulge serves as a stark reminder that warfare encompasses far more than mere tactical and operational maneuvers. Psychological effects, cultural factors, and perceptions play equally critical roles in shaping the course of conflicts. Sometimes, a failed operation that induces widespread panic and fear among the enemy can cause far-reaching strategic disruption, potentially more impactful than a successful, undetected attack. In this sense, the psychological ripple effects of operations, even when they fall short of their immediate objectives, can influence the overall trajectory of a conflict in profound ways. The interrogations carried out at checkpoints, which might sometimes seem absurd or overly rigid, had an underlying strategic purpose. They relied on the fact that genuine Americans possessed knowledge and cultural references that infiltrators, despite training, could not easily replicate. These interrogations tested the authenticity of identity and allegiance, serving as a vital line of defense against enemy infiltration. For the soldiers fighting in the Battle of the Bulge, the challenge was not only facing a formidable enemy offensive but also grappling with the pervasive suspicion that enemies could be hidden in plain sight, wearing any uniform, speaking any language, hiding behind any guise. This pervasive uncertainty eroded the soldiers' sense of security and marked a significant evolution in the conduct of warfare. This gradual erosion of certainty, fueled by the constant threat of infiltration, introduced a new dimension to warfare, one rooted in psychological warfare, suspicion, and the need for rigorous security measures. It prompted changes in military strategies and security protocols that would influence how future conflicts were managed and how nations safeguarded themselves against clandestine threats. Ultimately, this transformation underscored the complex and multifaceted nature of modern warfare, where perception and psychological resilience are just as vital as battlefield tactics, shaping military operations and security practices for generations to come.